Hello everyone, it's just another day in the clown decade where it's getting worse before it gets better. This is part 3. If you've not seen part 1 and 2 of me reacting to Grace Blakeley in this interview, please go visit them in the link below before getting to here. And I'm going to just try and pick out the best bits of the rest of the video that I can react to, because she's got to a point where she's just starting to repeat herself. So let's get right into it and finish it off. Anyway, they start talking about capitalism and mental health, so here we go.
Yeah, I think that example of mental health is really good, right? And I want to say you wouldn't see this when it comes to people's physical health, right? You wouldn't be like, oh, no. It's your fault that you've got lung cancer because I don't know, like you're not looking after yourself, you're not taking your daily turmeric or whatever.
Yeah. Typically people are told they have lung cancer because they smoke, and if it's not that, it's just a typical family history of lung cancer or possibly exposure to other dangerous chemicals in your respiratory system. I don't think I've ever heard you didn't take enough of your turmeric, you got lung cancer before. That's a new one. And that sounds more like, a natural remedy substitute to me rather than, modern medicine, which, according to these people, pharmaceutical companies drive down the importance of natural remedies like that to try and make money from their drugs. So it's kind of weird that the conversation's been inverted with that one comment, but okay.
But actually you do now see that, right? It's like, instances of illnesses that result from social issues like air pollution or not having an adequate diet or whatever, increasingly are being blamed on individual people.
I don't think I've ever seen anyone blame anyone for getting lung cancer for their own individual choices outside of smoking. Are you confusing people blaming smoking for lung cancer when people smoke like 20 cigarettes a day for 50 years, and then trying to say people are doing the same thing for air pollution from cars? No, I don't think so.
Again, coming back to this idea of like, what is Marxism? We trace back things that happen in the realm of ideas to things that happen in the realm of production, in like the economy or in politics or whatever. We don't just say, oh, suddenly everyone changed their minds, or there was a really powerful ideological movement that made everyone change their minds.
So she's about to make the argument that it's our material conditions that create the world that we live in. In other words, the world that we live in changes according to our material conditions, which in a lot of ways is true, but when it comes to the realm of ideology and ideas, I don't think that's entirely down to the material conditions that you're in. For instance, communists still have the same modus operandi and still have the same overall ideology still 100 years after the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, they just have different tactics to actually try and get to their ends. Originally it was, political revolution and violence. And these days it's a lot less violence. It's more your, Extinction Rebellion type protests of trying to shut down cities, where you don't actually kill people, but you do cause enough of a ruckus in everyday lives to get the government to do what you want, which effectively they are doing. There is that much money going into the green sector. Obviously it's not 100% effective. We're still getting oil and gas licenses being doled out, but if you actually read their handbook, which I have done before and which I have done a video on, again link in the description, then you will see that they are pretty openly, if not communist, then socialist in their end goals, with a quote-unquote decentralized system that ends up just being centralized anyway into citizens' assemblies, which are essentially there to rubber stamp whatever they want. I mean, they're pretty clear about that. They say they want local people to vote for everything that goes on in their local area. In reality, it will just be a rubber stamp exercise.
Those things are important, and these movements are spearheaded by, powerful groups of people who make these arguments in the public sphere.
To a large extent, that's true. It is true that you need an ideological vanguard to change society ideologically. However, the problem is that when you get to an ideological vanguard on the right wing, they are typically poo-pooed by the establishment. The best examples of an ideological vanguard we have on the right wing is people like Matt Goodwin, people like Nigel Farage, but they are typically getting punished by the larger overall institutional structures. If Nigel Farage gets debanked, Matt Goodwin is risking his place at Kent University and his professorship. He's talked plenty about how he's not particularly welcome in his own institution that he's been working at for, 20 odd years or something like that. Whereas people like Grace Blakeley, I mean, she's been doing the rounds recently because of this book, which, if we're going off the explanations she's giving in this interview, is total garbage. But the establishment is perfectly happy with total garbage analysis because, well, if you have total garbage analysis as your main counteragent to your own establishments, then, well, the establishments are just going to win because they can deal with garbage analysis and garbage counter movements.
I do also think that a lot of the big shifts that we see can be traced back to what happens in politics and economics, basically.
I mean, obviously the implementation of new ideas will rather largely come from the government when the government spends 40% of GDP on public spending, has completely bastardised the free market to the point where I believe we're below the bottom 20 for most free market countries in the world at this point. And wouldn't you know it, everyone thinks things are getting worse. So the more we are moving away from a free market system, the worse things seem to be getting. And I think the argument from Marxists is going to be, well, if we're in a transitionary period, of course things are going to get slightly worse. But the thing is, that's a really handy excuse for them at the same time as well, because they can say, we're always in a transitionary period until we get the result that they want. And we're never going to get that result, so we'll be in a constant, awful transitionary period.
And in the 80s, you did see this big shift towards the creation of the kind of individual, like, investor entrepreneur, the mini capitalist, basically.
Wow, that sounds really useful for the growing middle class. That sounds really aspirational. I can't take this seriously because I suppose I come from a family that really took advantage of that in the 80s. My dad originally didn't go to university, but he ended up getting a job in software and then did a degree during the 80s, part-time, and then obviously continued to work and started dealing with foreign customers for his company. And it was great for trade, it was great for business, and it all exploded in the 80s, and it's part of the reason they're very rich now. But, you go to the north and you go to old mining towns, yeah, sure, it wasn't great for everyone, but those people that moved out and actually got jobs in other sectors and dealt with the change well, basically, did really well for themselves. I know plenty of people that have done that. And these people absolutely hate people who hate Thatcher, because typically those are the type of people that got a really good pension at 30. Basically, the type of person who hates the idea of the 80s and Thatcherism is people that only focus on people that, and this is going to sound quite ironic saying this to Grace Blakeley while she's saying all this, but people that couldn't deal with the change. But there's no way you could keep coal mining going forever, given that it was costing the UK billions and bringing it to its knees, only to get a 3-day working week anyway.
Things like pensions privatisation, right? It adds to this massive pool of capital that can be played around with by the financial sector, by these huge asset managers that we now have, institutions like BlackRock, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. It has absolutely given BlackRock an awful lot of power, and that seems to be resulting in investments they are making, and effectively they are dictating terms to people that they will invest in with ECG scores and all that. But the thing is that Grace Blakeley likes the idea of ECG scores. Sorry, I mean ESG scores, which for those who don't know, it's essentially a score that incentivizes companies to be as environmentally, socially, and governmentally conscious as possible. As an example, the closer you are to net zero, the better you do environmentally. The more you have, equality, diversity, and inclusion programs, the more social you are. And the government one, which is probably the least worst, is effectively how much or how open is the company with government compliance, i.e., is this government following the laws of the land, and are they open about that, and are these rights and understandings easy to find? However, the thing is that this all comes down to market forces. The more socially conscious they are, let's say, they end up with a Bud Light situation where they put a man who is clearly a man pretending to be a woman front and centre, and they end up losing money. Disney's ending up losing a lot of money because it's putting an awful lot of stock into Marvel films that are trying to follow ESG scores, specifically, obviously, the social side of things. And, Apple... Was it Apple? Yeah, it was Apple. Apple came out with a short film that is effectively them trying to say, oh, we're going to be as environmentally helpful as possible. Mother Nature's played by some random black woman, and the company says, I do mean this, by the way, you can see Despot of Antrim's video on this, they say that we want to get rid of all carbon in the atmosphere, which obviously they mean carbon dioxide, but it just shows how little they actually care about these things when they say something like that, because if you had no carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, literally all trees would die. because they need carbon dioxide like we need oxygen. But again, this is the type of thing that Grace Blakeley is in favour of. She just wishes that it was done by the government rather than BlackRock. However, the thing is that before, in an earlier part, she says that there is a weird incestuous relationship between big businesses like BlackRock and the government. So, by extension, she's got the world she wants, she just hates it because some people are richer than she is. Again, all communism is window dressing. All this really comes down to is the intuition that people have it better than me and I'm very envious of it. Effectively, an awful lot of people in the modern world are breaking the 10th commandment, which is effectively do not be envious of your neighbour.
It's this institution that controls other people's money, basically, and is invested in most companies, most large companies in the world, just because, you know, it has indices that track what goes on in the stock market.
Yes, it's a financial company. A lot of people like to put money into it because it does make them money. However, because it has to make money, it's going to start dropping things that can't make money, or in other words are unpopular, are not good for business. And this is why I'm not too worried about ESG scores, because ultimately they seem to be making things worse and making its investments less money. Because you've got to realise it's new elites running these types of companies, and they will think the idea of ESG scores are great because they think, oh, I'd happily pay more money for things that have a high ESG score. But at the end of the day, people either don't care about ESG scores or notice how it makes things worse. So don't worry, good old capitalism should make sure that they change course on that eventually, and if they don't, well, I guess that we bail them out again.
And you have, basically, as a result of that investment power, the head of BlackRock is able to write to the corporations that BlackRock has invested in and say, we think you should do this, we think you should do that, right?
Yeah, but the thing is that the this and that is exactly the type of thing that Grace Blakeley wants. Have net zero carbon emissions. Have a very large HR department that makes sure that you have, like, you know, half of your workforce being of black women lesbians. Maybe make half of them trans as well. Which I don't think she will go into detail on, because if she goes into detail on that, she'll say, oh, actually, I kind of like this. No, she'll just say, oh, they're shadowy figures and telling other companies what to do. When, at the end of the day, what they're telling other companies to do is be more woke. You know, do more of what Grace Blakeley wants you to do.
That is not the way that a free market is supposed to function.
A common theme that you have probably worked out in this video is that Grace Blakeley has actually made the argument that yes, we do not live in a free market economy and we don't live under capitalism. Yet at the same time she's written a book that says we live under capitalism and it's made slaves of us all. So I guess thank you, Grace, for being an idiot and doing the legwork for me here and working out that yes, we don't live under capitalism or a free market economy. We do live under corporatism, and that corporatism is actually doing what you want to do. But you won't go into detail on what they actually tell other companies to do, because it's exactly what you actually want. I'm honestly believing at this point that you are a BlackRock shill, you know, this type of 4D chess thing, where effectively you are so bad at analysing what is going on, it actually looks like a psyop, and it's going to make normal people think that BlackRock's actually doing nothing wrong. Because you really need to go into detail on what they are actually telling other companies to do, otherwise no one's going to believe you.
A free market is supposed to be lots of little individual people putting their money into a pot, and then the money goes to the most profitable firms, because that's how the market works.
I don't know where the idea of people putting money into a pot and then that pot goes to the best companies comes from. No. Capitalism is all the way down to just individual people making trades that are mutually beneficial, and the government getting out of the way of that process as much as possible, i.e., as lower taxes as possible, as lower regulations as possible. I don't know where that summary of capitalism came from, because it's completely wrong.
It's not like these huge behemoths that are basically able to direct and plan what happens within markets.
Well, that actually depends if that's what generally the people want to pay for. If people want to pay companies that are making really good decisions and doing really well at things like that, then you know, people will pay for that. That's absolutely fine. This is the thing. Capitalism isn't one thing or another. Capitalism is effectively allowing people to make their own individual choices, and then that will organically make a society that they all want via revealed preferences. Whereas at the moment, we've got a government that is spending 40% of GDP on public spending, which, by the way, that's a lot. A third of that is just redistribution, by the way. That means something like 12.5% of the UK's GDP is going directly to redistribution of wealth, which is an absolute insane amount, by the way. Which, by the way, people don't want. We can tell they don't want that because they keep voting for 14 years for the Conservatives, who, as people are happy to admit, even the people that vote for them, they are supposedly the party of less government intervention. I know this because I met a load of Tory members and they all agree with that. And yet that proportion keeps getting higher and higher and higher and higher. Immigration keeps getting higher and higher and higher. And as Grace Blakeley herself has said, we can't get capitalism or a free market environment. It just seems impossible at the moment, which is why I'd still say vote reform. Yes, despite the issue with folding to hope, not hate. I mean, yes, they're not going to be the best at actually fighting the system, sure, but my God, it's going to be a hell of a punishment for the Tories to actually move right. And then maybe they can do something in the near future. We're beggars at this point. You've got to bear in mind our biggest issue on the right wing at the moment is that we have to convince like 80% of the population that they've been gaslighted for 30 years.
And obviously, the long boom of the 1990s, and there was this like incredible optimism that was among the kind of the capitalist class at this point. Gordon Brown said, we've ended boom and bust.
Yes, well, how wrong that turned out to be. As Thomas Sowell says, the first rule of economics is that there is never enough of anything to satisfy all of those who want it. And then the first lesson of politics is to ignore the first rule of economics. In other words, you are always going to have boom and bust cycles. It is the way the economy works, because working out where to put best resources is an incredibly complex system that will be ever changing, and because it's dependent on human behaviour, it's basically impossible to model. And so when a politician says we've ended boom and bust, that is them ignoring economics. But yes, I'd love to see where Grace Blakeley goes with this.
Communist countries are going to become, these free market utopias.
I mean, to be fair, some of them did. Poland is a pretty decent example of that, to be quite honest with you. I went there recently. It was pretty good. It was a hell of a lot cleaner, and it felt a hell of a lot safer than my average walk through Manchester. I'm not going to lie to you there. Also, just to make the point even clearer, here is life expectancy for a lot of Eastern Bloc countries. As you can see, there's quite a spike after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Wonder why that is.
It was hard to argue against, right? Even for those on the left, there was the sense that, fine, capitalism's kind of won. Like, what can we really do other than like
end of history?
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, I suppose to be fair, I can understand the viewpoint of the end of history, but obviously things are always going to regress, because the more perfect things get, the more humans will try and make them worse just so something interesting can happen. Because humans are hyper-fixated on actually trying to problem solve, and, well, I mean, I believe a lot of people were getting complacent. And also, Tony Blair in his first term, he was trying to continue neoliberalism, and then come his second term, he did start to try and turn things away from neoliberalism into more a post-Keynesian world. And then certainly after 2008, selling our gold reserves, for example, because apparently we're totally reliant on fiat currency. I mean, it just goes to show that we did live and do still live in a post-Keynesian world rather than a neoliberal world. But obviously Grace Blakeley thinks we still live under neoliberalism, because if things are going bad, that's neoliberalism, despite the fact she's just admitted that neoliberalism is when global trade and free markets, and at the same time she said, oh, we don't have a free market, so pick one.
And then you get the financial crisis and you realise that all of that was just based on not only a kind of lie, a political lie, but also just deeply unsustainable economics.
I need to know what she means by the lie there, but the unsustainable economics, mainly for the housing crisis, did come from poor financial decisions. And honestly, when the banks fail, I would have only bailed them out insofar as get these people that you gave a bad finance deal on into a position where they won't literally die, and then after that, we'll default you on this bailout, but you're going to have to fail as a business because you did just fail as a business. And it's quite weird because some banks were allowed to fail and others weren't. It just so happened that the multinational banks are the ones that weren't allowed to fail, but I guess the US dictated the rules a bit on that one.
And a politics which has really just torn apart the fabric of our society. And we're living with the result of that now. We're living with the result of the kind of the arrogance of the ideologues of capital.
Yes, but again, if you're blaming that on capitalism, again, you're just completely wrong. Why is there such an incestuous relationship between finance and government? Because government bailed them all out. So now, yes, they are in quite open cahoots on things like this. Why do you think a third of your ESG score is how much you comply with the government? I mean, it's just a good idea to do that anyway. But it should be assumed that all these institutions are following government guidelines anyway, because most of them help make them. And the thing is that Grace Blakeley doesn't really understand that the reason that these institutions like BlackRock are so entrenched is because they're the only companies that can actually afford to comply with the government, because there's so much regulation that is hitting cost margins and profit margins, I should say, and increasing costs, that obviously only the richest of them can survive, and this is why you get, small cartels and monopolies. But I wouldn't be shocked if Grace Blakeley's answer to all this is, oh, well, clearly we need antitrust laws and to deregulate them to try and break them up. Whereas, guess what? Those types of things are pushed by these large institutions to entrench their place. It's deregulation that is the real answer to this, but Grace Blakeley would never even consider that, despite the fact that she knows regulation has gone up since Margaret Thatcher's days, and with that there is a perfectly strong correlation with that and the entrenchment of these large institutions.
And yet, because they were so successful in shattering our sense of collective agency and our ability to imagine a different world, we haven't moved beyond that.
It is so ironic that it is Grace Blakeley saying this. It's crazy. It's the capitalists of the world. It's places like the IEA, the Adam Smith Institute, which I know they're all pro immigration and all that. Yeah, fine. They're wrong on that. But they can actually imagine a different world than the one we live in at the moment. They can imagine one where at the same time we are keeping the beauty of Britain. I mean, Tom Harwood isn't a great spokesman for this sort of thing, I completely agree. But there are people within the IEA and Adam Smith Institute that, they want a metropolitan area between Liverpool and Manchester, which shows just how southern they are, I suppose. But the point of the matter is that this is the imagination of a different world. And they understand that actually deregulation is probably going to lead to that. These are the people that can imagine a different world, and it's ironically one that's more capitalist, but either communists completely lack imagination, which I don't think they do, because they're very good at making up stories about how the world works, even though it's completely false. But for some reason, when it comes to actually changing the system, they really don't have that many ideas that aren't too different from how the system actually already works. Grace Blakeley likes how the world is being run at the moment. She just doesn't like that a lot of people are getting very rich off it. If you ask these people what their ideal policies would be, I would be shocked if 70% of them aren't already implemented in the UK. Tax the rich, for example. Oh, well, we're taxing the rich. The top 10% pay 60% of the income tax, say. Big oil companies, tax them. 75% windfall tax. They can only keep 25% of their profits. Redistribute the wealth. 12% of our economy is dedicated to that. We need net zero. The UK has halved its carbon emissions since its peak in the, post-industrial revolution. The reason that these people can't imagine a different world is because we effectively live in the world that they want. That is why they can't imagine it differently. Because they have most of the policies they want. They're missing probably, 20-30% of their policies. Sure, you still have private companies that aren't worker co-ops, whatever. Is that going to make much of a difference? No, because most people really don't care. They'll just, it'll be like the unions. They'll just vote the way they're told to anyway. They have the world they want and they can't appreciate it because their ideas are so garbage that all it ends up is with mass depression and people dying of overdoses in quote-unquote safe injection centres. I mean, I know that's a more foreign issue for Canada and certain US states, but that's one of the big policies they're missing, and that's how it's going to result. I mean, Scotland's already tried to have a looser approach to drug crime, and oh, guess what? They have the highest rate of drug deaths in the whole of the UK.
I think the problem that we have with organising today is that even collective institutions have been, paralysed by this sense of individualism. They've kind of been infected by individualism.
Okay, so at this point I can pretty much confirm that, when Grace Blakeley says individualism, she just means something I don't like. It's crazy that, the train union, the nursing union, the doctors union in the UK are infected by individualism, when I know people who are involved in these unions, and they have to go on strike. They don't have individual autonomy in that sense. They have to strike. I don't believe they get paid for it, but I think they get paid a bit of compensation by the union themselves. And it's all for everyone's increase in wages, and that's pretty much it. I guess that's not it with the trains, though. We still want ticket offices open, despite the fact that barely anyone uses them. They don't want conductorless trains, which I actually think is a bit more reasonable because they act as almost security on the trains. So it's not like everything that they demand is unreasonable, but to say that it's been infected with individualism, I mean, if we're going off the fact that a lot of union leaders are millionaires, that was the same in the 70s anyway. So an awful lot of union workings haven't changed in that sense then.
So if you go back to the Lucas plan, so, contrast what happened at Boeing or, indeed what happened at Port Talbot with the example of the workers at Lucas Aerospace in the 1970s.
Oh, back to the Lucas plan. I'm sorry, I absolutely love it when communists say things like this. I really do, because it's, oh, look at this thing that failed. The Lucas plan was never implemented. And I suppose, to be fair, that is because Lucas Aerospace Management really didn't want this plan to go ahead, because effectively then they wouldn't have a job. Like, the incentives are understandable there. But you try and implement this plan, I don't think it's going to work. Or to be more specific, it's not going to work for absolutely every company. But you want to transition a aerospace weapons manufacturer to one that makes things for the social good, which arguably weapons are for the social good because, they help defend Britain's interest with a international deterrent, then I suppose I'd like to see how that would have gone ahead, sure. I just can't see it working. If it was the best way to run a business, you would see pretty much every business running that way, but they don't. Most businesses run with a, hierarchy of management, and they seem to do very well with that.
It was this incredible business plan, basically, that totally undermined the spirit of capitalism, which is that the owners own the firm, the managers manage the firm on their behalf, and the workers do as they're told.
It's so dishonest. She's acting like worker co-ops don't exist. No, they do exist. I think the biggest one's Spanish, in fact. And one of their biggest kind of publicly renowned policies is that, the biggest ratio between worker and manager is like a 1-to-9 ratio. So a manager can only earn 9 times as much as the worker, and this is all agreed upon democratically within the cooperative. Like, great, good work. The corporation is called Mondragon, by the way. It's a Spanish corporation. Just a summary of the business culture. The cooperatives are united by a humanist concept of business, a philosophy of participation and solidarity, and a shared business culture. The culture is rooted in a shared mission and a number of principles, corporate values, and business policies. Over the years, these links have been embodied in a series of operating rules approved on a majority basis by the cooperative congresses, which regulate the activity of the governing bodies of the corporation, Standing Committee and General Council, the grassroots cooperatives and divisions they belong to from the organisational, institutional and economic point of view, as well as terms of assets. The framework of business culture has been structured based on a common culture derived from the 10 basic cooperative principles which Mondragon is rooted: open admission, democratic organisation, the sovereignty of labour, instrumental and subordinate nature of capital, participatory management, payment solidarity, inter-cooperation, social transformation, universality, and education. Basically, a bunch of jargon there. But the point I'm trying to make, though, is that you can make these sorts of things under capitalism. This whole company was made post-Spanish Civil War, which was a fascist state, for God's sake. I mean, according to Grace Blakeley, fascism is the end point of capitalism anyway. And you can still make your ideal company. In fact, the biggest one in the world grew from it. If you can make these sorts of things under fascism, then you have absolutely no excuse doing this under capitalism, which is apparently the midway point between communism and fascism, for God's sake.
And this is all based on the idea that entrepreneurs and workers and managers are these really clever people who just know how an organisation should work and are really good at telling people what to do.
I mean, having worked jobs for some years at this point, yes, there is a pretty wide berth between the best and worst managers. The job I'm at the moment probably has one of the best managers I've ever had, and then the worst manager I've ever had was at an international finance business. He would basically not keep me in the loop on anything, and then when I eventually left that job, his feedback was completely different to what he told me to my face, effectively. Which I suppose, to be fair, he was probably told to say those things by higher-ups who didn't particularly like me because I left quite quickly because I hated the job. However, the thing is that Mondragon, the biggest cooperative in the world, still has managers. And from what I can tell, they actually struggle to get managers because a lot of Mondragon is in the engineering business, and managers in the engineering business typically make an awful lot of money compared to the average worker within them. I think Wikipedia says it's usually hundreds of times what the average worker makes, and yet it's obviously a 9-to-1 ratio at the very most there. So they actually have trouble hiring managers, but hey, it seems to work. So who am I to say that this company deserves to fail? It seems to be doing pretty well. But even when it came to my worst manager, as a worker, I still have conversations with them. We still come to an agreed kind of, that's too much work for me. Please pass that on to someone else because I don't have time to do it. Or, hey, I'm not doing an awful lot at the moment. Is there anything else you need me to do? Or, I've seen that this needs doing. Should I do it? There's still... I don't think Grace Blakeley has ever worked a proper job, essentially. I think she's only really ever worked as a freelance journalist, and then obviously she had 5 articles as economics correspondent at Vice. I don't ever think she's had a proper manager, and so I don't think she's in a position to actually understand how managers work. Again, I even worked at a supermarket, and I had more say in what I did there than I think Grace Blakeley really thinks that I did. I mean, okay, every morning for 2 hours I'd stack the shelves for the fresh food because it would just come in. But after that, it was, depending who the team lead was that day, it was almost agreed upon by everyone what jobs everyone did. Sometimes I do magazines, but if I didn't feel like it, sometimes I just go on tills, and if I didn't want to do that, I could do, I don't know, freezer food or something like that. I just kept the job interesting by switching up which part of the job I needed to do at what time, and it was perfectly fine. And sometimes, I didn't get the choice because something else needed doing urgently, but that's fine. I'm in a job, I'm paid to do that. And when I got bored of it, I moved job. I don't understand why people struggle to do that.
And workers at Lucas Aerospace were like, no, we know exactly how this firm should be run. We know what we should be doing. We're perfectly capable of managing ourselves.
And you know what? Yeah, they probably were, I guess. I guess I would have liked to have seen the Lucas plan actually be implemented, because there is something about these leftist experiments going through that's always just so fascinating. Either these co-ops tend to devolve into basically running like every other business anyway. The only real difference I can tell from Mondragon and other businesses is that the managers are paid a hell of a lot less. From what I can tell, I mean, I know I've only read the Wikipedia page, but the only thing that Wikipedia seemed to bother to actually talk about was the wage regulation in the business culture and the fact that this is agreed democratically. Aside from that, they still have yearly business plans, 5-year strategies. They still have business plans like every other business does. And the managers are the ones making sure that happens. I do wonder if Grace Blakeley would say that's not true worker cooperatives.
It threatened this idea that people need to be managed and controlled. And I think that is actually the most threatening thing that we can believe in a capitalist economy.
Again, Mondragon is my best example that that's not true. It was obviously more the board of directors that didn't like the idea of this, because they were obviously going to have to take a massive pay cut because people thought they were greedy. And again, I'll just be repeating myself at this point, but I've never felt quote-unquote controlled in a job. And if someone does feel that they're controlled in a job, they can move jobs. I know people that have job hopped for like 5 years at a time because they haven't found the right fit yet. I don't know what world Grace Blakeley thinks we're living in.
There's this little town in North Wales called Gláeddyv, and instead of allowing themselves to be consigned to this idea of like a left behind neighborhood, the people in this town got together and they basically said, we're going to start a community enterprise.
Yes, it effectively became a tourist town, and yet, exactly this is what the ideal is under capitalism. These people can literally go, oh, these investments are going down, my job's going down, we need to start finding alternatives. And effectively the alternative for this town was create a tourist destination, because they had beautiful landscape, they had slate cabins, and they had railway stations that were heritage sites. So it effectively became a place, or a town, in the countryside with a classic railway station with steam engines, places where you could do water sports in lakes, do mountain biking up in the hills nearby, explore slate caverns, and yeah, people did pretty well out of that. That's great. I don't see why capitalism stops that. It seems to have done all right for Blaenau-Ffestiniog.
Instead of, paying tons of money to these, privatized utility companies, when there's hydroelectric power that's being, monopolized by this corporation, we could actually just generate our own power ourselves.
So I believe she's saying that Festiniog Power Station, which is run by First Hydro, again a UK-based energy company, was quote-unquote extracting all the wealth. I mean, I cut that bit out, but she does say extracting the wealth, despite the fact that it made an awful lot of jobs for the area in the 50s and 60s, and obviously is still running today, and apparently the locals found new ways of making power themselves. Honestly, I'm having a Google. I can't find anything. I mean, Grace better go into detail on what the alternative power situation is here, because I literally cannot find anything, and as far as I can find, the hydroelectric power station is owned by a UK-based corporation, and always was. So I don't know what the hell she's talking about.
And suddenly you had all of these community enterprises springing up, just this incredible ethos of self-help. There was some support through something called the Communities First programme by the Welsh Government, but largely speaking, this was people just being like, we don't have to accept things being this way.
Oh my god, no way. A capitalist country allows people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and allows them to make money in their own way? Wow, no way. I can't believe a society like that works. Why in God's name would you be against that?
You see a similar sort of thing in Preston, for example, where you have the community wealth building agenda. The council is supporting the creation of cooperatives, democratic local banking, all these different things.
Yes, the Preston plan. This is effectively it's a thing that Navarro Media and people like Grace Blakeley, Aaron Bastani, Ash Sarkar absolutely love to praise to no end. And I mean, I live relatively close to Preston. Still ain't that great. But they basically just like the idea that the local government is investing an awful lot in the local community to make more business, which, I'll be honest, if you're going to have public money put anywhere, I would rather put it in businesses that are going to grow like that, so that actually makes a return on investments, rather than just giving endless cash to pensioners, a quarter of which are already millionaires. But as far as I can tell, all this stuff that's been happening in Preston, all the returns are still theoretical as far as I'm aware. This is a plan that's been going on for the good part of a decade at this point, and as far as I'm aware, Preston is still one of the places in northern England where people are still trying to get out of. I believe it was even in fully automated luxury communism where Aaron Bastani was lauding this plan. And it's effectively just protectionism. I mean, here's a summary. At the local level, there will be a programme of municipal protectionism. Public sector bodies and related organisations will spend as much as their budget as possible locally in order to retain money in the local economy rather than allowing it to leak out. He calls this the Preston model, after the city of the north of England, where according to Bastani, a small-scale version of this approach has triggered a multiplier effect, taking off in the city as pounds are continually recirculated through the local economy. And obviously he wants to expand this so that only local worker-owned businesses would be favoured by public contracts, and from there they would have to meet specific criteria, whether it be that the company is within a few miles of the county, or within the county obviously. It has to be a worker-owned cooperative and offer organic products or be powered by renewable energy. In other words, what Aaron Bastani wants is BlackRock at the county government level. But yes, this is just protectionism on steroids, and basically no economist, not even left-wing ones, think protectionism is good at the country level. So I don't understand why these people think it will be good at the county level. And as I say, Preston isn't exactly the richest town in the north at this point. In fact, Manchester is the fastest growing city in the north, mainly because it's investing hugely in its tech sector, which is a growing sector.
And the biggest thing standing in the way of our getting from here to there is just this pervasive and widespread belief that I am on my own, there's nothing I can do, the powers that are united against me are too strong, and, you know, no one else wants to work with me to change things.
I mean, I've mentioned it throughout part 1 and 2, but it's just a nonsense. Over 90% of our current top 1,000 on the rich list are self-made millionaires. They're self-made rich people. Like, this idea that people are individuals and they're alone and they're not allowed to cooperate with other people, it's a nonsense. I mean, for God's sake, she's just come up with a few examples. Preston and, the North Wales town, where apparently people came together and found an alternative to having to, say, move to a big city and work in a massive engineering firm or something like that. No, apparently they could just do it all locally. They could actually make business, make their own wealth. That is the point, and you can still do this. It's a lot more difficult than it should be, I agree. But you have literally just given success stories under capitalism and then said, oh, people don't think that you can succeed under capitalism. Why do you keep giving examples where it can? Even by your criteria of success. Unbelievable.
You go to these communities and people do not share this like individualistic competitive mindset. They have, you know, their own personal dreams and aspirations and wants and a secure sense of their own self, but they also view their identity as tied to what happens to the people around them.
Right, so if it's not been clear at this point, Grace Blakeley is just an idiot. She is one of these people that thinks that individualism means that you can't cooperate with other people. You're literally not allowed to, otherwise it's collectivism. No, that's not what that means. Individualism and collectivism is effectively how things work under law, or how people are treated under law in politics and in political economy. Individualism takes a stance of, you know, everyone is effectively free as an individual. You know, everyone has the choice to, I don't know, switch jobs, to move where they want to do what they want to on their own land, within a reasonable extent where you're not harming others. You are free to make your own business with the government and other collective forces, not having much of a say in how that is run, how it is made, and what you make. However, collectivism is effectively the state or some centralised body dictates to you what you can and can't do. And, you know, under every system there's a mixture of the two. The problem is that we are going way more collective than we are individualistic at the moment, because it entrenches, as I've said over and over again, these monopolies. And under an individualistic system, you can actually have your dream of you make a collective community. Under the laws of the land, they will be treated as individuals. Within your community, you can do whatever you want. You can make whatever rules that you want. The one thing you can't do is force them to stay there. And that's your massive issue. Individualism allows people to leave your collective. And you don't like that because most people would leave it because the results are god-awful.
I'm really struck by these examples of like what a better future possibly looks like.
Yeah, I mean, it just means democratizing everything.
If we were ever to make my personal hell, I think forcing me to have a decision-making power on absolutely everything in the world would be one of them. I don't care. I don't want to spend time or money or my thought process on the Gaza-Israel situation to actually have a say in it. I don't care. I don't care how my business is run as long as I'm happy there. It's a point I make to communists all the time. You know, when they say, oh, but don't you want to say in your workplace? I say, no. If it gets bad enough, I'll move. But if they pay me, I'll put up with quite a lot because it's not a huge part of my life. My life is outside of work. And then they effectively say, well, don't you want to end the cycle and just stay at a place forever? It's like, no. I might hate the people, you know? I can't really democratically get rid of the people I hate because, you know, the people I hate would probably all hate me as well and vote me out. And then what do you do about the people that are literally voting in a company against everything that the majority want? What do you do about people like that? Because they're going to move anyway. All that ends up happening when everything is a worker co-op is that effectively, because it's a soft form of communism, it actually brings down the, for lack of a better term, disagreeable geniuses that actually make businesses hyper-succeed. Assuming they're lucky and make the right decisions, sure. But the thing is that Grace Blakeley will be absolutely happy with that because that means that basically no one gets rich. And no one gets rich because the business basically breaks its own legs. I mean, even the worker co-op Mondragon has limits to what can actually be voted on, for God's sake.
Like just demanding more power being handed down to, whether that's, you know, local communities, whether it's, you know, devolution and decentralization, whether it's demanding workers are able to take power within their organizations, you know, the removal of the massive restrictions that have been placed on our rights to do things like protest and assemble and speak out against, you know, the horrors that are being committed by our government here and all over the world.
I think the only thing I agree with there is, I mean, remove the devolved governments from Wales, Scotland and Ireland, but give slightly more power to the local councils, I think would be the best thing to do. Because something like 70 or 80% of our tax money goes straight to Westminster, and that goes straight to Whitehall. And I'll be honest with you, they do a lot worse a job than local councils. I'm just going to be honest here. Local councils obviously are, they're still within the leftist framework of things, I guess you could say. In some cases, I'm sure it's worse. But at least the power of your vote has a lot more say there, because you can vote for a number of councillors and have way more say in your local area. And it's more how the Swiss system works, and their system's pretty damn good. But my God, the rest of that, I don't want to vote on things in the workplace. As far as I'm concerned, the very higher ups of a company want something, those managers under them then devolve down to the managers all the way down to below them how they want that, the solution to the things that the higher ups want. And then that eventually gets to me, and I just do the work, man. I just want to do the work here. And guess what? If I wanted more of a say in a company, which I suppose in a way with revealed preference I did, I go join a small company. I'm one of 3 developers. I have a hell of a lot of say in how the development of the products we are making goes. And I have constant conversations with my manager about these solutions. And the freedom it gives me, yeah, it's quite a lot, but guess what? I earn that place. I don't just get it given to me on a plate. And absolutely everyone can do that. You don't just get something for nothing. It's not the way of the world, and it never will be.
Now we live in a country where the kind of liberal democratic revolution of the kind that we saw during the 1800s, that hasn't even been completed. We've still got a monarchy. We've still got an unelected chamber in the House of Lords. We still have a private corporation that runs, the heart of our financial sector.
Oh my God. These people got Brexit and want more democracy. I don't think they realise that. I think most people, while they like the idea, I guess, of all houses being elected, most people like the monarchy still. There is a ridiculous, extreme, visceral hatred of the conspiracy theorists that were coming up with X, Y, and Z reasons as why Kate was missing, and now it turns out she has cancer. And everyone hates the conspiracy theorists more than ever now. Which, by the way, prayers to Princess Kate, because cancer is horrible, and I hope her recovery is swift and causes as little suffering as possible. But, back to the point. People like the monarchy. They love it. And for anyone who says that our tax money goes towards them, it's not true. The sovereign grant is a proportion of the money that comes in via the Crown estate. They are probably taxed more than your average billionaire. And when it comes to the House of Lords, people hate it at this point because of the fact it is just an openly corrupt institution. Basically, all the new lords that go in are appointed by, either prime ministers or after the end of Parliament, people are given peerages. Basically, the House of Lords is just a whole bunch of lobbyists appointed by MPs and prime ministers at this point. And that's what people don't like about it. It is effectively just a way for a whole bunch of new elite people to just be put in there. When obviously in the old days it was, a family going through with the heirs making it to the House of Lords. And the whole idea was that you then have incentives to keep the House of Lords going for your, sons or daughters, whatever. I think it was just sons at one point. Probably always was, actually. I'm sure John will correct me. But instead of having to worry about whether they'll get elected in 5 more years, they'll say, I want the country to work really well for my kids, my grandkids, and the generations beyond. And we don't have that anymore. We have people that effectively only vote on things dependent on whether it makes them feel good at the time or not. Because they're just thinking, I get £300 a day just to sit on this bench, and a piece of toast is about 5 pence from the cafe here. So yeah, it needs reform, but it doesn't need the type of reform that makes it another elected chamber. Because, quite frankly, I don't think people in the UK actually like voting. I think an awful lot more of them would be perfectly happy with the government that is very limited, doesn't particularly get in their way, and because of that they don't really feel like they have to vote. I think people would be much happier that way. You want the complete opposite, and I can only see it making people more depressed. For the simple fact of these people will feel like they've got more power, and in reality they will have no more than they had the week before they got that power.
We have these neoliberal shifts that have aimed to insulate even more areas of the state from democratic accountability. So, we have the Bank of England being made independent, i.e. Not subject to democratic scrutiny.
Well, wouldn't you know it, Liz Truss was trying to challenge that, and you absolutely hated her and thought she ruined the economy. So don't give me this guff of we don't want the Bank of England to be independent. You absolutely did when Liz Truss was in charge, because you think it saved the country, when in fact it was them that caused the LDI issue that we had in the first place, that the independent bank decided not to tell Liz Truss's cabinet about, and therefore that's why we ended up with a bit of market turbulence, for God's sake. Honestly, all of these quote-unquote independent, which just means unaccountable, institutions are basically doing everything that Grace Blakeley wants, and she doesn't even realise it. All she wants the Democratic side to do is effectively kick out anyone like me or the, Tories that she hates. When in reality, for 14 years, even though the Tories have been completely useless for all that time, people were still voting for them. And what are they doing now? Well, they seem to be moving over to reform that is slowly but surely overtaking the Tories in popularity.
But
and this is all because people don't particularly want to vote for anyone, by the way.
Spaces where people are organising with tenants to prevent rogue landlords.
Yep, that seems reasonable. And yep, people do absolutely have the power to do that.
Organising with migrants to support them to fight for their rights.
Okay. Two main things she wants democratised. Landlords that are punished for being rogue. Fair enough, I'm for that. And then migrants and their rights. Yeah, this is why I don't believe that when she goes to places like Preston and all that, I don't think she actually talks to local people all that much. I think what she does is go there and only really ask councillors and people in charge how it all works, and they'll just give her the completely idealised version of what's going on there without any of the harsh realities, because you ask people in North Wales and Preston what they think of immigrants, I think they will be more anti-immigrant than she is making out. But my God, your second priority being more rights for migrants, I don't know what more you could want. We can't even deport criminals, for God's sake. Anyway, they move on to talking about protesting, and that Starmer's position has moved from, well, their version of it is collective punishment against Gaza to calling for an immediate ceasefire, which, as I've gone through in other videos, is more reasonable and nuanced than the SNP's version, which is just ceasefire unconditionally. Labour actually say Gaza needs to release the hostages and stop attacking them. And the interviewer is hoping that this is due to the street politics, and this is what Grace Blakeley has to say.
I think it's more to do with the fact that the American state's position is slightly, marginally shifting as a result of the utter chaos that's going to be unleashed as a result of this conflict, and that Britain basically follows tail between its legs.
The UK is absolutely influenced by the US, there's no doubt about that, but again, still wrong. No, a big reason that they changed position on it is because there were direct threats to MPs. They've had to up security. They completely bastardised parliamentary procedure to bring Labour to the forefront of the SNP's opposition day, which I still don't know how Lindsay Hoyle's still in his job after that. But hey, here we are. No, this is a thing that the left are not allowed to talk about. The fact that we are actually in a world where MPs are under more direct threat than ever. And if it was genuinely from the far right, that is what they would constantly bring up, but they don't bring it up at all, which just goes to show you that no, the perpetrators are mainly Islamists.
But having said that, part of the reason that the situation is becoming so untenable over there and over here is because people are refusing, as you say, to just accept the mainstream narrative as to what's going on.
No, I think it's more the fact that Israel are inevitably winning this, and people are getting a bit uncomfortable, because people do get uncomfortable when there's a total wipeout of one side in a war. But I'm done talking about Israel, Gaza. Grace Blakeley's wrong, and she's completely ignoring the fact that MPs are being directly threatened, and some have even suffered arson attacks, so whatever, I'm just going to skip this bit.
I don't think that the presenters on the BBC are deliberately skewing the output that they put out there.
To an extent, I think I would agree. I don't think Emily Matlis would say what she said about the BBC if she actually had full editorial control over what she was presenting. However, what she is presenting is mentally left-leaning pretty consistently. I mean, all the Corbynistas can really point out is that one picture of Jeremy Corbyn with a communist background that happened, 5 years ago? Whereas righties seem to have something to point out at question time literally every week. And if not that, it's Newsnight. I mean, a huge scandal recently was, years ago, Newsnight interviewed some Syrian refugees who were accused and then acquitted of sexual assault. And a few years ago, it was just their side of the story of, effectively they were calling the woman that they were accused of raping a whore and saying that, she wanted it, basically, and they were coerced into it because they were 18. Anyway, a few years down the line, it goes back to court, and it turns out that they were rapists, and the BBC did absolutely no investigation work into it. They just let them ramble on about their side of the story. And did the BBC get punished for it? No, absolutely not. But this is what I mean. There are so many examples of them being left-leaning rather than right-leaning that I cannot understand the perspective of people saying the BBC is right wing. I literally can't.
What I do think is that how is the news agenda formed? Like, how is the news reported? It's reported based on what happens in the papers, right? There's always a paper review. What determines what goes in the papers? Well, these are literally owned by like oligarchs and like massive corporations that just exist to promote their own interests.
To an extent, that's true, but even then, okay, Daily Mail, Express, yeah, you have some right-leaning ones, but you know, people take the broadsheets as the more reputable papers. You know, the Times, the Financial Times. When it comes to the BBC, especially the Guardian, and these are all left-leaning papers to, you know, from middling left-wing to quite far left-wing, like the Guardian. And you know, you have the Telegraph as the one reputable right-wing paper. And even then, when you do these paper reviews, there's usually some comment about the Telegraph not being particularly reputable because of its right-wing leanings. So even then, the papers are generally doing what Grace Blakeley wants anyway, especially the Guardian for the most part. And then when you do have right-wing agendas actually making it through to the mainstream, like the small boats, nothing even gets done about it properly. In fact, things seem to be done like the Rwanda plan that just make any solution seem untenable. It's like, yeah, we tried, but it doesn't work, so now you just have to live with illegal migrants. Like, great.
Or it is determined by what politicians say. So politicians in many ways kind of shape the news agenda. I remember talking to a presenter not that long ago who was like, well, if you want this item to be on the news agenda, then you need to get Keir Starmer to say something about it, because otherwise we can't report on it. It's not news.
It's a bit of a self-report, isn't it? Effectively, what the presenters have said there is, we will follow the agenda of the Labour Party. If you want something to get on the news, you need to get the Labour Party to say something. It wasn't multiple examples or anything like that. She didn't say, oh, you need Keir Starmer to say it, or maybe the Home Secretary, James Cleverly, something like that. No, it was just Keir Starmer. And I think that's a bit of a self-report, that she actually does realise that it's more the left-wing side of things that, you know, dictate what is said in the news. Though obviously these two don't think Keir Starmer's left-wing, despite the fact that he is, and he's only superficially right-wing with things like, oh, we actually should be okay with the flags being put up, and maybe we should get Labour members to actually sing the national anthem, but we need to give them pamphlets with the words on because they don't know them.
When you have this, narrowing of the political agenda among the two biggest political parties, the news follows, and it creates this air of unreality, because you're like, why aren't we hearing about some of the biggest, most important issues?
Again, Grace Blakeley, just agreeing with the right-wing perception. The parties have narrowed. There's hardly any difference between them. But I suppose when you get your golden child Corbyn and he's pretty quickly kicked out because he's one of the most unpopular political leaders of the Labour Party that's ever been put up for an election, then I suppose you would say, oh, the party's moving right, when in reality the party had a bit of a blip going quite far left, because Ed Miliband, in all of his worldly wisdom, decided that it should only be £3 to join the Labour Party, and basically all students joined and went, you know what, I will vote for anyone that makes sure that I don't have a student debt. Despite the fact that it's already massively on the side of the students. But anyway, I suppose when you move from there to Keir Starmer, I understand why you're saying the party's going right, but in reality it's still going ever further left if we take the actual average over time. You know, you have a bit of an extreme with Corbyn, sure, but they ain't moving right wing, I can guarantee you that.
If you want to move away from, questions around conflict, why aren't we hearing about the fact much more frequently that, like, last year was, potentially the warmest year on record? Maybe we're starting to see breaching the Paris agreements, about 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels.
Are you kidding me? That's all over the Guardian all the time. Oh, I saw that reported in the Times. The problem is that people just don't believe that that's actually the biggest issue and that we're all going to die. That's the issue you've run into. You've been so hysterical about it that you've believed your own lies about it, and then when it is reported, it's not reported in the way you want. It was on the news. It's been on the news plenty. You can go on The Guardian, they've got a whole section dedicated to the climate crisis. It's constantly brought up on BBC News, but it's not to the extent where it's it's breaking all the time. Oh my god, we've made it over 1.5 degree threshold, or at least, it's actually just projected. Oh, and that's assuming we still keep getting the warmest winters on record when, we had like a 5-year break from it. I mean, for God's sake, it's March and there was snow in the mountains last week in North Wales here. People just don't believe that we are going to make pretty much every animal on Earth extinct. I mean, people know that we've got more polar bears than we had in the last 30 years because polar bear hunting's gone downhill. We're doing pretty well as conservationists, at least on land. Oceans, I completely agree. But as you say, that's hardly ever mentioned, because climate change takes the whole cake there. It's ridiculous.
You write in the book, since Thatcher, political debate has failed to break out of a sterile dichotomy. Those on the left argue for higher public spending funded by taxes on the rich. Those on the right argue for cuts to public spending and tax. When we accede to the idea that politics is a battle between the state and the market, we play into the hands of the right.
Holy moly, do not buy this book then. I mean, if you think that talking about, taxes and spending has been in any way favourable to the right, you need just to give your head a wobble. Highest public spending since the war. Highest tax burden since the war. We have such a large government at this point. It's not even a joke. If you think we have a right-wing government in any way when it comes to economics, no, you need to give your head a wobble. You need to be kicked out of polite commentary society because you don't know what you're talking about. Playing into the hands of the right. Honestly, do you think so? Oh, great. We've had a national insurance cut by 2%. Great. Do you know what though? Because they have frozen where your personal allowance is, because that's stuck, more people than ever are actually paying the tax. So because more people are paying the national insurance tax, they can actually afford to cut it by 2%. And then they're adding a load of stealth taxes anyway. Like, they're making up for it. Despite it being a huge 2% cut in national insurance, I suppose this could be playing into the hands of the right if you wish to see it that way. Then yeah, it makes it look like the Tories are cutting tax. I mean, sure, I think that is because a general election is coming up this year. But the problem is that realistically you can get that 2% cut, but then when all your bills are still high and then you're seeing prices still rise, it's not going to feel like you're that much better off anyway, so it's going to come back to bite them. And the annoying thing is that because that is seen as, oh, the right-wing tax cut didn't work, then it's playing into the hands of the left anyway. We're utterly screwed as a country. This is the best that the left wing can offer, apparently, and it's full of idiots.
I think after that, talk about how we need to be presenting the idea of socialism not as a project of protection, but as a project of collective empowerment. So it's not about going to people and saying, businesses have been mean, so hand more power to me, a politician, and I'm going to save you. Or indeed, politicians have been mean, hand more power to me, another politician, and I'll do things differently, right?
But that's what you want. That was the whole point of Corbynism. What do you think democratising everything means? Who do you think is going to enact the will of the people when you have workplace democracy, or you have more democracy than ever in your local council, let's say, or within the country, or within your county, or within your street? It's got to be some sort of civil servant doing that, i.e. a politician. You want an expanded civil service is effectively what you want to enact all these things. Effectively, you want to expand the managerial class, and every single point that you've raised has in some way emulated a right-wing critique of the system. You know we don't live under capitalism. You know that we don't have a proper free market. You know that you can even make, your ideal Preston haven in the system that we have at the moment, because we literally have Preston existing. And yet what do? No, I actually think that we need more managerial work. I think that we need more new elites in these positions of power. But, I don't want to call them politicians, so I won't. I'll just call them something else. But they'll effectively be doing the job of a politician. She is not a serious person.
It's about demanding that the people who are in charge actually respect the people that they're supposed to govern enough to give them the power to shape the conditions of their lives.
See what I mean? She initially says, oh, I don't want more politicians. And then all she says is, actually, I do want more politicians. I just want them to do more of what I expect them to do. That's all she said there. She is an idiot. Oxford education, folks. Apparently you can't beat it.
Which, by the way, the Labour Party is now considering rowing back on the one little tiny thing it has left, which is these promises on workers' rights, which are barely even enough to begin with.
I mean, good Lord, thanks to the Equality Act, which, to be fair, when I say get rid of the Equality Act, there's probably some things in there that probably should be kept. But overall, I think it's a thing that you need to burn down and build back up from the ground up. But and with workers' regulations, effectively, okay, for your probation period, you're pretty easy to fire. That's probably for the first, few months or so. So sometimes it can last up to a year. You don't have that many protections, to be fair, but that's because, you're a new hire. There are people that can game the system and just, get a job for the money but not really do that much. You get past that probation period, you are basically impossible to fire. You are basically impossible to fire. And when it comes to, workplaces, they are by law required to make it as comfortable as possible for, say, disabled people or people with long-term illnesses. And, I think that's okay to an extent. I mean, obviously, these people typically get lower wages because, say, they work less hours or something like that. But I don't think things like that are unreasonable. But honestly, if you think we live in a world where, workers' rights are completely restricted and we effectively live in Victorian London, I've got news for you. We live in one of the most pro-worker environments known to man. Yeah, there are some really bad managers and bosses, sure, but my God, that doesn't mean that the law is pathologically pro-worker. Anyway, she ends up repeating quite a few of her points and brings up other examples that I frankly can't be bothered to go through at this time because I've had way too much stupid takes from her at this point, so I'll just let her get to her concluding statement.
In an ideal liberal political philosophy, government is supposed to be a representation of our collective power. It's supposed to be the mechanism through which we all govern ourselves. The liberal theorists were like, we were in the state of nature and everyone was attacking each other, so we all came together and decided to form a state. That's obviously not what happened.
I mean, that was only some certain liberal theorists. I mean, yes, there were certainly people who thought the state of nature was, a life that was nasty, brutish, and short. And, I mean, she obviously is memeing there, saying we decided to come together and make a state. I mean, obviously it took thousands of years. What really happened was, these individual cavemen or tribes, well, they started to come together to make tribes, to cooperate, and eventually that cooperation would expand and expand and expand until, you end up with an elite strata of society, King Alfred, who would join up all these tribes and kingdoms together to make England and then go on war to assimilate even more cultures and tribes. And effectively then obviously a nation state is more of a modern concept, I guess, but I'm kind of failing to see how, I'm failing to see exactly the point where Britain stopped being a feudal non-state and became a state. It seems to be a kind of interwoven thing, if that makes sense. More of a process that happened over 200 years or so rather than something that happened overnight. But it almost seems like Grace Blakeley is rejecting that idea, and in fact humans were always not necessarily mass societies but lived in society, which liberal theorists don't reject that necessarily. The state of nature is a thought experiment more than it is an actual representation of prehistoric man, because we've evolved from apes who have tribes themselves, so obviously we will have had tribes from our very inception. However, it's the thing. The main difference between humans and chimps is that you will never see two chimps carrying the same log together to go to the same place. Humans do that, so we do have a cooperative spirit. The thing is that Grace Blakeley seems to think that we only have a cooperative spirit, and the individual side is of absolutely no help whatsoever and is actually quite unnatural. When in reality, there are hermits who are fully capable of living their entire lives completely alone. Clearly, we are able to act as individuals, is what I'm saying there. We just come together as a civilization because, my God, I love my heated house.
But, arguably, the true realization of the liberal dream is when government can actually become a mechanism through which we are all able to govern ourselves collectively, where we come together to make decisions about the future of our society amongst ourselves, rather than electing people who tell us what to do.
Inevitably, under everything being democratized, you are going to have that anyway. This is the thing. What are people who are elected, what are they doing? What are their incentives? Why do they stay where they are? Because of pie-in-the-sky promises, effectively. This is why Enoch Powell's whole idea of, he never really wanted the NHS, but what he wanted to do was, when he was health secretary, and if he ever got on from working there for 5 years, if this ever became the cabinet strategy, was to effectively do a whole audit of the NHS, pass that on to the public and say, this is what it is costing you. Now, we can either carry on doing that if you're, accepting of that, or what we can do is, slowly go back to the way we had it, which was to have your friendly societies, have your kind of community-wide insurance policies where you can choose your doctors and all that, and that should end up being cheaper, and not only that, actually yield better results. But obviously that never happened. But effectively, I think you're always going to vote in people who tell you what to do anyway, because that's the whole point. You are allowing someone to get into power, and they will lie their way into there. You know, effectively, the people you vote in are only people who are good at winning arguments. In other words, they're really, really good at theorizing. They're not very good at practical problem solving, which I suppose this is actually why the Spanish company Mandragon has actually worked out quite well, because it's actually filled to the brim with practical workers. You know, it's an engineering company. So, well, yes, they probably do vote in managers, assuming they even vote in managers, to be quite honest with you. They're probably appointed by the higher-ups. But they probably do have good application of practical problem solving rather than just being pure theorists. Whereas if you're a politician, all you are is effectively a pure theorist. And that's why, frankly, ever since we've had universal suffrage, we've had people go in and just have policies that keep failing and failing and failing until you get to Margaret Thatcher, who was a chemist, for God's sake, who was a practical woman, and so was very good at the theory as well, because chemists do need a lot of theory as well, and so was very good at making and winning arguments. And then from there, she actually had practical solutions to Britain's problems, which is probably why she's the best Prime Minister we've had post-war. But the thing is, we've always had bad governments, always, throughout the history of Britain. The thing is that the government's never been big as it has been post-war. And, you know, it's as big as it's ever been now. And because they have so much of a responsibility and so much power over the British people, that is why everyone feels like they need to vote, even though people are getting more and more politically apathetic, and why people feel they need to constantly talk about it. This is why part of the reason I've made an YouTube account like this, because I feel like I have to. Alternatively, I'd love to just read fiction or talk about, you know, science, the environment, things I find interesting, but no, I feel like I have to talk about politics because they have so much power over me, and I don't like it. And originally I probably thought that, yes, the answer to all this probably is to expand the democratic workings, but now I think the opposite. I want less. I want less so that we have an excuse for them to have less power, and I think we will be happier that way. We were in the past. But anyway, I think that is where I'm going to leave this video. Obviously, Laughing at the Guardian will be on tonight. I will be having Mercy and Zen and my lovely girlfriend Tash on tonight to talk about silly opinions from the Guardian from the week, and I have no doubt that they will be worse than Grace Blakeley's opinions here. So if you enjoy this and you enjoy light-hearted content, you will definitely enjoy Laughing at the Guardian, so catch me there at 8 PM UK time tonight. But in the meantime, that's everything I had for you today. So as usual, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.